A continuación, le vamos a dar la palabra a los disertantes de la presentación denominada Developing IROC, Integrated Remote Operation Center for Upstream Industry, que será presentada por Gonzalo Hecker y acompañado por Guillory y Mohammed Saadat. Así que, disculpas, de la empresa Accenture, y le damos la palabra a ellos entonces. Muchas gracias.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for attending today to this presentation. First of all, I would like to introduce us, Guillory as Senior Technology Consulting Executive and Mohammed Saadat as Senior Business Strategy Executive for Energy Industries, both based in Houston, and myself, Gonzalo Hecker, as Management Consulting Manager for Energy Industries, based here in Buenos Aires. Today, we will be presenting a really interesting case for IROC implementation in upstream industry. The client, one of the main oil and gas international companies with onshore and offshore operations in more than 30 countries, wanted to define the vision and the roadmap for deploying and implementation of data and analytics driving operational dashboards to increase visibility into real-time operations and improve production efficiency. Specifically, the scope of the project involved the processes of operation and maintenance of more than 1,000 shale wells spread across 3 different onshore regions for the North American filial of the company. Next, as the agenda of this presentation, Sheikh and Mohammed will be explaining the main aspect of what we consider an optimal integrated remote operation center and showing us how an agile methodology can be successfully applied for IROC implementation in upstream. After this, we will show you a description of data architecture and system integration implemented for this client in this case, as well as the operating model optimization involved, and the main results and conclusions of this experience. Mo? Perfect.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Hecker. Appreciate the time. So before I get into the IROC, let me kind of just lay the foundation in terms of the context here. So what we'll be talking about is essentially a continuation of a journey with a client. The journey started somewhere around 2018 and has progressed, and essentially the capabilities have evolved in the production operations domain, and this is what we will touch upon. In terms of just the footprint, this is a client that has, as Hecker, you mentioned, they're based in Eagle Ford and in Bakken. In Eagle Ford, they had about 550 wells, looking at about 50,000 BOE. It's an aging gas field. In Bakken, about 700 wells, looking at about 60 to 70,000 BOE per day. And on the Eagle Ford side, we had mostly plunger lift and gas lift as a primary mode of artificial lift. And on Bakken side, we have gas lift and rod pumps. Really, what the genesis of this program started with a problem that the client was wanting to solve, and it started with Eagle Ford, where they had good coverage in terms of automation, in terms of SCADA coverage, in terms of connectivity. The challenge they were having was, and essentially was twofold. One, they wanted to improve their productivity of their employees on the front lines. Second, they wanted to reduce the windshield or driving miles, and that's really what the genesis of sort of the business problem that was presented, and what led to the genesis of the IROC program. And what we'll talk about more in terms of what this this program was and what kind of outcomes. What you see in front of you are sort of what I call the fundamental building blocks of this IROC program, and it starts with as I mentioned, there is a business problem that we're solving, and essentially looking at how technology and analytics, the digital enablement of that of solving that problem but really the heart of this is the change in the way we operate, right? So before we talk about technology, before we talk about analytics, it's really about defining how we're going to work differently in terms of making the decisions that will drive a reduction in the miles or increase the worker productivity. And just to kind of give you a little sense of what I mean by worker productivity, they had about in a classic field, or we would see we had about 25 wells to a lease operator or an operator or the well site operator. And on an average, what we saw with other competitors, their peer group, they were somewhere in the 50 to 60 wells to a lease operator. So there was clearly a gap in terms of the resource efficiency and how they were being utilized. So one of the things was to figure out, okay, how do we use the information that we're getting from the field to help prioritize a set of activities and get greater visibility into those activities. So again, looking at this piece, there was a clearly defined problem that we were going after. In terms of technology, analytics, and Jake is going to double click on the technology and the front user experience. But I think that the key takeaway here is, before we talk about, machine learning, before we talk about, artificial intelligence, there's some sort of fundamental questions that we want to ask. What is the quality of the data? How is the data being consumed? How often is this data coming through? So as we sort of progressed in the journey with this client, yes, we saw some uptick in improvement in the resource efficiency and also in the number of miles that were driven. But at the same time, it was also a journey of building capability from a data management standpoint. In terms of technology, how do we scale? And this is something that Jake will talk about in terms of platform. Do we build our own? Do we go out and partner with ecosystem partners? And how do we scale appropriately? Then in terms of front user experience, I think this is a critical one. So for many of the types of decisions that were made, we really put the user, or basically the person who's the decision maker, front and center in creating that user experience to say, well, how do you make decisions today? How will you make decisions in the future? And really architect the visualization around that. Organizational governance is really focused around sustainability. How do we mature the capability? How do you make sure that you're continuously improving? And change management is really focused around understanding what does it take to make this capability stick. So once the team has been dismantled and they're doing improving on other pieces, how do we make sure that the fundamental pieces are in place? So this is something we'll talk about, but again, just wanted to give you a sense of how do we go from a decision to from an insight to a decision to an action. So I think that's kind of the piece that we'll talk about. Next slide. So as a starting point, what we did was we got their frontline folks, everything from production supervisors to the lease operator to the production engineer, the asset manager, all together in a room and said, look, we're definitely trying to solve this problem, but really, how would you want it? What would this vision be for you if you were able to? And what are those sets of decisions that you can operationalize if you had the digital enablement tools available to you? And this is sort of the picture that came up. They said, look, we want to go beyond just wells and production. We want to start looking at maintenance. We want to start looking at beyond wells, looking at the production system rather than just a few wells. And and it was not so much as a problem in Eagle Ford, but certainly in Bakken, there was a big problem around water management, around hydrates that were forming. So how do we start using data, and from data converting that into useful information so that we can drive decisions across the board, and really helping us. And again, for folks who are familiar with the onshore unconventionals, you will appreciate this, that the challenge is the scale. I mean, it's what we see, which is different from the offshore, is we're not talking about a few wells, we're talking about 1,000 wells or so. So how can we use the digital to help us prioritize so that we have the right experts who then focus on those key complex decision making? And then the other piece that we're looking at is how much of this decisions can be moved to the edge. So we have a lot of players in the marketplace that are focused around this edge decision making. So how do we drive some of these routine decisions up to the front lines, and then the complex ones over to the right folks in the operations or in the production operations domain? Next slide.
Sorry, Mohammed.
Yeah.
5 minutes to finish the presentation and then the question.
Okay, go ahead.
Yep. I will take us through the next couple slides quickly and get us to a wrap up. So I think Mo covered a lot about our methodology and our process here. We did use an agile approach, but more importantly, we used a user-centric approach, as Mo was referring to. So really understanding who in the organization would be impacted, how they would be impacted, what's the vision for their way to work in the future to address the scale and complexity that they have to do in the fields that they operate, and really going through a process where we identify that, discover it, define the new ways of working from a persona-based view by those who are impacted the most, and then engage in an iterative process of co-creating the tools or assets that are required to enable the insight to action workflow that Mo was referring to earlier. Using that, I think the key points here is we're driving that forward with scale in mind. And so underpinning that co-creation, we worked with data that existed, with technologies that existed within the corporation. Through there, we were able to, there's obviously good data, areas that have better data coverage than others, but actually using that approach, we were able to, one, clearly demonstrate value from the data, and then also demonstrate where the enterprise needs to focus to improve data quality or data reliability to enable scale, and really work in concert with that data team to highlight where the opportunities are, to give them focus and clarity so that we can then work together to take it to the next step and continue to build that experience. And so at the end, you see, through this process, we have a number of key deliverables, including a new reimagined work process that's optimized with clear structure or organization structure and job profiles, including the physical layout of the integrated remote operating center rooms that were put at the assets, and then a clear roadmap and vision for how to move from its starting point to its North Star. It manifested itself into an integrated dashboard where we integrated 10 business systems, initially created 14 interactive views as a pilot, and receiving data, refreshing from their SCADA systems on a 15-minute interval. If you can please move forward. To double click in the data architecture, as we promised at the beginning of this, one of the key principles, right? Again, two of the key principles: use existing data, use existing data sources and technologies that the enterprise had. And in this particular case, the client had made a architectural decision around maximizing the Microsoft Azure stack, which we did in our proof of concept. Everything on the left was existing source systems that were used in the organization. The data hub was a part of their architecture for master data. And then that fed into the Azure data lake to collect the raw data with those source systems and those in that master data system. And then we built the data warehouse star schema for the support of the dashboard that we visualize in Power BI, and then leveraging the R machine learning, Revolution R machine learning, and the Azure Analytics Data Services to analyze the data, to run the analytics, to look for anomalies and opportunities to make decisions upon that we visualized in the Power BI dashboard from that standpoint. If you move one more slide, again, these are kind of a view of the types of data that we were pulling from each of the systems that we were integrating, and some of the outcomes that which we were to achieve with production efficiency, identifying the well health and looking for anomalies within each individual well versus their current baseline, to then identify where there might be signs of degradation or issues to come that we could take proactive. And a view on deferred volume. This particular client was looking at downtime rather than volume deferred. We actually gave them an insight that shows them how to prioritize volumes, the high producing wells over the, even if you let the lower producing wells be down longer to drive for value and impact to the business. Again, we used Microsoft Azure and Power BI exclusively. We even used it on the mobile capabilities and it was able to get that into the user's hands in an initial kind of 8 to 10 week sprint, then iterate it from there. If we move on, I think we get to a bit of the conclusions of where the results, and it can wrap up from there, Mo.
Sure. So just really quickly, I think, in terms of the impact, what we saw was across the board, and we're talking in a few months rather than several months. We saw an improvement in the downtime for Eagle Ford. It went down from 21% downtime to 7%, and for Bakken it was around 15%, and it went under 10. Again, the Bakken is a developing asset. It's still being developed. For this client, Eagle Ford is obviously mature. So again, really the focus is, Jake talked about the sort of the architecture that was enabling a lot of the decisions, but at the end of the day, it's really about how those decisions are being made. What is the change in the way the work was being carried out. So we worked from a serial type of decision making to very prioritized, looking at production losses and some of the capability that we built, which was around prediction to see where the liquid loading was. We were able to proactively act and essentially make those decisions quicker than we were able to make. So overall, I think we saw an uplift in terms of downtime.
Mohammed, is the time.
Okay.
One question, the complete solution is into the Azure architecture?
Yeah, the analytics and the visualization was all done within Azure. The source systems, some were on-prem, but the data flow and the data architecture is all based in Azure.
Okay, thank you, Gonzalo, Mohammed, and Sheikh for the presentation and your times.